Well, bonjour, good evening, and thank you to Le Président. I'm delighted to be speaking here. I'd be obviously more delighted if I was actually in Paris, of course, which is a wonderful place to be. I'm speaking to you from Brisbane in Australia, and I'd just like to acknowledge the Jagira and the Turrbal people on whose land I live and work. Now, the words innovation and audio are not always seen as going together. Just ask this man. This man is Lord Kelvin, and he was quite sure more than 100 years ago that radio and audio was going nowhere. But audio has been one of the most innovative media for the last, for many years, whether it's the first remote control radio, a radio that you can take with you in a hat from 1949, or radio in cars, or radio in your pocket. Radio has always been a very innovative medium and a wonderfully innovative place to be. The radio station that I used to work at in London, Virgin Radio, was the first to broadcast on the internet in Europe and the first to have its own streaming radio app, and the first to podcast every day as well. And radio has been at the forefront of that audio innovation for many years. So today in most countries, 9 out of 10 people listen to the radio every single week. In France, the numbers are a little bit different because the public numbers look at weekdays and weekends separately. But when you look at weekdays, 75% of people in France listen to the radio, and they listen for an average of 2 hours and 42 minutes every single day. But we know, though, that radio is becoming more multi-platform. And on radio, we're listening not just on FM radio, but also over the internet and on DAB+ as well. And then, of course, there's podcasting. Podcasting is growing tremendously well. And these are figures from the US. And you can see that monthly podcast listening is now 37% of all US adults. And that's a tremendous amount of people, over 100 million people listening to podcasts every single month. But when you look at the amount of audio that we're listening to, podcast, yes, it fits in there, but there's still an awfully long way to go. This is data from Australia, and it shows the share of audio, the share of all of the audio that we put into our ears in this country. Live radio does fantastically well, streaming audio as well. Podcasting is there with only 8% so far. There's still a long way to go. Let's have a look at the same numbers, but from the US. And the US looks, to be honest, quite similar, with live radio 63% and podcasts only 4%. So there's an awful lot of growth that's going to happen in terms of podcasting. But things are changing as well. The devices that we use to listen to audio are changing. This is data from the UK, and it shows how old people listen to audio. They listen to the radio. They all listen to the radio pretty well. When you look at younger audiences, it's very different. With smart speakers, with computers, with radios. But the thing that young people listen to the most in the UK is their smartphone. And their smartphone works fantastically well. Different devices work in different ways as well. A smart speaker is mainly used for live radio. A computer is mainly used for live radio. A mobile phone is mainly used for on-demand audio, things like Apple Music and podcasts and stuff like that. When you look at how young people versus old people listen to different types of audio, then you can see the young people, yes, they're listening to an awful lot of on-demand content, podcasts and Spotify, and live radio is still there and still doing very well, but nowhere near as well as older people. Even something as simple as headphones has a big difference in terms of podcasts and downloads, which are right at the top of this, and live radio, which I'm afraid is right at the bottom. So the way that we're listening to radio and audio is different, is changing very fast. And so when I talk to radio people, I'm always talking about how headphones are great for on-demand content and loudspeakers are great for live content. And that's something that's certainly worthwhile pointing out. Certainly also worthwhile pointing out is the change in content that we're listening to. Young people are now spending, in fact, all people are spending less time listening to music and more time listening to spoken word. This is data from the US over the last 6 years, showing that spoken word has really increased and the amount of music consumption has gone down slightly. The amount of total audio that we listen to has also gone up. And similarly, the share of time, you can see a tremendous increase in terms of young audiences here for spoken word audio, and it's coming away from AM and FM radio. Technology is also really changing the way that audio is being produced and the way that audio works as well. When I was in radio a long, long time ago, I used to use these things. This is a razor blade and some Chinograph pencil and some sticky tape. And this is how we used to edit audio when I was learning radio. Then we moved to this sort of thing, a computer, but now things are going even easier with tools like this from the BBC, which allows you just to edit audio as if you were editing a word processor. You can also cross audio off on pieces of paper using a special pen. And now there's a piece of technology called Descript, which uses very similar technology that everybody can actually use as well. There's other pieces of technology being used too to make audio work even more interestingly. This is a podcast in the US called Consider This from NPR. And depending on where you listen to this podcast, you'll get local news and local information. If you listen in San Francisco, you'll get different news in this podcast than if you listen in Chicago or in Boston. So dynamic audio insertion is working really well to make something sound a bit better. There's another example here from Australia, The Quickie, which is a daily news podcast, which uses dynamic audio insertion to put the latest news headlines into every single episode of this podcast, but also adds longer investigations into specific stories that work for a longer amount of time. So technology allows you to do a lot of very clever things. Here's something that I discovered a couple of months ago. This is a podcast which you actually choose what you want to happen to the characters. It's a drama podcast. And you actually say, yes, I want the characters to walk into the spaceship or walk out of the spaceship or all that sort of thing. It works tremendously well. And another way of using technology is to use technology in terms of super local podcasts. This is a radio station called Alfred, which is making local podcasts available to their audience in one small town in the UK. And right now, in the middle of lockdown, it's working really well for them to keep people involved and to keep people active in their local community. New technology is also allowing new forms of content. Anchor and Spotify launching shows with music relatively recently, which allows you to add music to your shows and music to your podcasts as well. So new technology is really offering new, exciting ways of innovating with audio. And then audio is going to more places and reaching more people. This is a brand new Porsche car, and it has Apple Podcasts inside. It's the first car that I've seen that has Apple Podcasts in it, and it looks very smart. I'm looking forward to them sending my own Porsche to play with. I don't think they're going to do that. Here's another example. Amazon has spent a long time working on getting podcasts into Alexa speakers and into their own apps and services like that, which will mean that podcasts reach new audiences. We've also seen an awful lot of change in terms of the apps which are out there. Spotify now has nearly a quarter of all plays for podcasts. Apple Podcasts still a very important thing, but Spotify's growth is being driven by the fact that people are not just using Apple phones. People are using Android phones, particularly in Europe, where nearly 70% of all phones used today are Android phones. And that means that the amount of consumption on podcasts, this is a Czech podcast from Czech radio, the amount of consumption is really growing in terms of new platforms, in terms of Spotify, which is the green here, as well as Google Podcasts and Apple in there as well. So there's a tremendous amount of growth of new ways that you can listen to podcasts, and new podcasts too, non-English podcasts that aren't in my ridiculous language, are growing and have now overtaken English ones, which is a great thing. And we're seeing different ways of funding as well. Almost 1 in 4 podcast listeners will tip their favorite podcasts, according to some research. So there's real opportunities outside of advertising. And finally, we're seeing a bunch of helpful pieces of information about local podcast rankers. They are really important. This is the Australian podcast ranker, showing you some of the top podcasts here. But I would argue that they need to be a bit more globally aware. Podcasting is globally consumed and globally sold on mainly global platforms. Podcasts that focus on individual countries don't work too well. Podcasts and podcast rankers that only focus on individual countries aren't that relevant to too many people. Just ask Magellan how successful their service was. So a global platform like podcasting, I would argue, needs global solutions for measurement and needs to reflect all podcasts consumed in a country, not just locally made ones. So what are my thoughts? Well, my thoughts, I think, come back to radio, as I spoke about earlier. Radio and podcasting. Radio, I think, will continue being very popular in terms of audio, but podcasting is growing rapidly in terms of revenue and audience. Radio has learned that multi-platform is important, and podcasting, I think, needs to be available in as many places as possible. There are some podcasters, particularly Radio France, who are trying to control where audiences consume podcasts. We shouldn't be controlling our audiences, and nor should we try. And radio has been locally consumed and locally sold, but podcasting is different. It's part of a global ecosystem. It's great to have local data, but I believe it needs to fit into how podcasts are sold across the world. So from that, I'd like to say thank you, merci for having me speak. I hope you have a great rest of day, but for now, I will hand you back to Paris. Thank you.